Rain slashed across Thomas Mitchell's windshield. 46 years old. Bone-tired. Another night shift behind him. Then the headlights caught it. Twisted metal. Dark sedan wrapped around the guardrail like a broken toy. Steam hissed from the wreckage. Thomas slammed the brakes. Gravel crunched under his boots as he sprinted toward the carnage. Inside, a woman slumped unconscious. Blood streaked her pale face. He reached through shattered glass, pulled her free from the wreckage. That's when he saw it. Silver chain. Tiny rabbit pendant catching the storm light. His breath stopped. His world tilted. 36 years collapsed into this single moment. The same necklace his 5-year-old sister Hannah had worn, the day she vanished, the day his family shattered. Thomas stared at the woman's face through the rain and whispered the name that had haunted him for decades. Hannah! The ambulance sirens wailed through Cedar Falls as Thomas followed the stretcher into the emergency room. His work boots squeaked against the sterile floors, leaving muddy prints that a janitor would curse later. The woman remained unconscious, her dark hair matted with blood, but that pendant never left his sight. 36 years. 36 years since he'd lost his baby sister at the county fair. He'd been 10 years old, trusted to watch her while their parents bought cotton candy. One moment she was there, tugging at his sleeve, excited about the carousel. The next, she was gone, vanished into the crowd like smoke. The doctors worked quickly, checking vitals, cleaning wounds. Thomas stood in the hallway, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. Should he call someone? The police had given up searching for Hannah decades ago. His parents had divorced 2 years after she disappeared, unable to bear the weight of their shared guilt. His father drank himself to death. His mother moved to Florida and rarely called. The family had crumbled like old paper, leaving Thomas to carry the burden alone. Now here was this woman, wearing Hannah's necklace, and Thomas felt like he was drowning in possibilities he'd buried long ago. "Sir, are you family?" A nurse appeared at his elbow, clipboard in hand. Thomas stared at her, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Was he? After all these years, could this broken woman really be his sister? I think so. He managed. "I think she might be my sister. She's been missing for 36 years. The nurse's expression softened. She'd probably heard stranger things in her career, but not many. "We'll need to run some tests," she said gently. "For now, she's stable. The head injury isn't as bad as it looked. Mostly cuts and bruises. She's lucky you found her." Lucky. Thomas almost laughed at the word. Was it luck that brought him down this particular stretch of highway at this exact moment? Or was it something else entirely? He thought about his 8-year-old daughter Mia, probably fast asleep in their trailer, unaware that her father's world had just shifted on its axis. Rebecca had been gone 3 years now, cancer taking her with the same cruel efficiency it had taken so many others. Thomas had been raising Mia alone, working double shifts to pay off medical bills and keep food on the table. Some nights he felt like he was barely keeping his head above water. And now this impossible woman with her impossible necklace. The hours crawled by. Thomas called Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, to check on Mia. Called in sick to his day job at Morrison's Plumbing. Sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs and drank terrible coffee while waiting for news. When the woman finally woke up, late in the afternoon, Thomas was there. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. Brown eyes. Hannah had brown eyes. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Thomas leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You're in the hospital. Cedar Falls General. I found you after your accident." She tried to sit up, winced, fell back against the pillows. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, fingers closing around the rabbit pendant. The gesture was so familiar it made Thomas's chest ache. Hannah used to do the same thing when she was nervous or scared. "I'm Thomas." he said carefully. Thomas Mitchell. Can you tell me your name? The woman stared at him for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes. Recognition? Fear? Amy, she said finally. Amy Johnson. But the way she said it, like she was reading from a script, made Thomas wonder if that was really her name at all. 2 days later, Amy Johnson was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and nowhere to go. She claimed she'd been driving through Cedar Falls when the storm hit, but she had no luggage, no identification, and the rental car had been paid for in cash. Thomas found himself offering her a place to stay, surprising himself with the invitation. Just until you get back on your feet, he said, but even as he spoke the words, he wondered what he was doing. Mia was curious about their unexpected guest, chattering away about school and her friends, while Amy listened with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. That first evening in the trailer, Thomas watched Amy's reaction to their modest home. She stood in the doorway, taking in the cramped space, the second-hand furniture, the photographs on the walls. Her gaze lingered on a family photo from 1987, the last one taken before Hannah disappeared. Thomas, his parents, and a gap-toothed little girl with pigtails. Amy stared at it for so long that Thomas began to fidget. That's my family, he said quietly. Before? Amy nodded but didn't ask questions. She rarely asked questions about anything, and when she did speak, it was in short, careful sentences, as if she was afraid of saying too much. The next morning, Thomas was making coffee when he heard Amy talking to Mia in the living room. You have pretty hair, Mia was saying. Mine's all tangly. Daddy doesn't know how to braid it right. Thomas paused, listening. Amy's voice was soft when she replied, Would you like me to try? I think I remember how. There was something wistful in her tone, something that made Thomas think of all the mornings he'd struggled with Mia's hair, wishing Rebecca was still there to help. When he brought Amy her coffee, Mia was sitting cross-legged on the floor, while Amy worked magic with her tangles, creating a perfect French braid. Where did you learn to do that? Thomas asked. Amy's hand stilled for a moment. I'm not sure. I just knew how. She finished the braid in silence, her fingers gentle and sure. Mia bounced up to admire herself in the hallway mirror, delighted with her reflection. Amy, you're the best. Can you do it again tomorrow? Amy smiled, the first real smile Thomas had seen from her. If you want me to. But there was something sad in her eyes, something that suggested she wasn't used to being wanted anywhere. Over the next few days, Amy fell into their routine with surprising ease. She helped Mia with homework, seemed to instinctively know how Thomas liked his coffee, and had an uncanny ability to anticipate what they needed before they asked. But she also had odd quirks that Thomas couldn't ignore. She flinched whenever she heard police sirens. She wouldn't eat anything without checking it carefully first, as if she expected it to be spoiled. And sometimes, late at night, Thomas heard her talking in her sleep, fragments of conversation that made no sense. Please don't be angry, she would whisper. Amy will be good. Amy promises. It was Mrs. Patterson who first voiced what Thomas had been thinking, but didn't dare say aloud. That girl reminds me of someone, she said one afternoon, watching Amy push Mia on the old swing set behind their trailer. Can't put my finger on it, but there's something familiar about her. Thomas knew exactly what she meant, the way Amy tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she unconsciously tugged at her earlobe when she was nervous, the way she hummed under her breath while doing dishes. All habits that belonged to a 5-year-old girl who'd been gone for 36 years. But Thomas was afraid to hope. He'd spent 3 decades learning to live with the hole Hannah's disappearance had left in his life. He'd married Rebecca, had Mia, built a small existence in Cedar Falls that felt manageable, if not happy. The idea that this quiet, damaged woman might actually be his sister was too big, too impossible. It would mean Hannah had been alive all this time, somewhere else, living through experiences he couldn't imagine. It would mean all those years of searching, of hoping, of guilt-ridden nights wondering if he could have prevented her disappearance had led to this moment. It would change everything. One evening, while Mia was at a sleepover and Amy was washing dishes, Thomas found the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside him for weeks. "Amy," he said, his voice carefully casual, "do you remember anything about your childhood? Your family?" She went very still, her hands frozen in the soapy water. "No," she said quietly. "I don't remember much of anything before a few years ago." But the way she said it, the careful emptiness in her voice, told Thomas she was lying. Not maliciously, perhaps, but lying nonetheless. "Sometimes," Amy continued, her voice barely audible, "I have dreams. About a boy. An older boy who used to take care of me. He had kind eyes, and he would read me stories and teach me how to skip stones. But when I wake up, I can't remember his face." Thomas felt his throat close up. He'd taught Hannah to skip stones at the pond behind their old house. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. "In your dreams, I mean." Amy shrugged, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "He went away. Everyone always goes away." That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about calling the police, demanding DNA tests, official verification. But something held him back. Maybe it was the fragile trust Amy had begun to place in him and Mia. Maybe it was his own fear of being disappointed again. Or maybe it was the growing certainty in his heart that this woman, damaged and guarded as she was, really was his little sister. The sister he'd failed to protect all those years ago. The sister who'd somehow found her way back to him, broken but alive. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after the accident, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Thomas was getting ready for work when he heard Mia scream. Not a playful scream, but a sound of real terror. He ran to the kitchen to find his daughter on the floor, blood streaming from a cut on her knee, where she'd fallen and hit the corner of the cabinet. Amy was beside her in an instant, but instead of helping, she was backing away, her face white as paper, her whole body shaking. "No blood," she was whispering. "No blood, please. Hannah will be good. Hannah won't make trouble." Thomas knelt beside Mia, pressing a towel to her cut while keeping one eye on Amy. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's just a small cut." But Amy wasn't listening. She was somewhere else entirely, her eyes wide and unfocused, lost in some memory that had nothing to do with their bright kitchen, and everything to do with a past she claimed not to remember. "Hannah won't cry," she continued, her voice small and childlike. "Hannah will be quiet. Please don't hurt Hannah anymore." The name hung in the air between them like a confession. Thomas felt the world shift, everything he'd suspected suddenly crystallizing into terrible certainty. This was Hannah. His Hannah. But what had happened to her in the 36 years since she'd disappeared? What kind of hell had she endured that made her terrified of a child's scraped knee? Thomas wanted to reach for her, to hold her and tell her she was safe. But he could see that any sudden movement might send her deeper into whatever dark place she'd gone. Instead, he kept his voice low and calm. "You're safe, Hannah. You're home. No one's going to hurt you here." Slowly, Amy's eyes began to focus. She looked at Thomas, then at Mia, who was watching with wide, confused eyes as her father bandaged her knee. "I'm sorry," Amy whispered. "I don't know why I'm sorry." But Thomas could see the recognition dawning in her face, the walls she'd built around her memories beginning to crack. "It's okay," he said gently. We're going to figure this out together. But figuring it out proved more complicated than Thomas had imagined. When he called the police to report that he believed Amy Johnson was actually his missing sister, he was transferred from officer to officer, finally ending up with Detective Sarah Morrison, who sounded tired and skeptical. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand your situation, but we can't just take someone into custody based on a feeling. If this woman has committed no crime, and she's not a danger to herself or others, our hands are tied." She paused. "Now, if you want to pursue a DNA test to establish familial relationship, that's different. But it would have to be voluntary on her part." When Thomas broached the subject with Amy, her reaction was immediate and visceral. "No," she said, backing towards the door. "No tests, no doctors, no police. Please, I'll leave if you want me to, but no tests." The terror in her voice was so raw that Thomas dropped the subject immediately. But he could see the trust they'd built beginning to erode. Amy became quiet again, jumpy, checking the locks on the doors multiple times each night. She stopped braiding Mia's hair, stopped humming while she worked, stopped looking Thomas in the eye when they talked. It was Mia who finally broke through Amy's defenses with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "Amy," she said one evening as they sat on the front steps watching the sunset, "are you my dad's sister? The one in the picture who went away?" Amy went very still. "What makes you think that?" she asked carefully. Mia shrugged. "You look like her, and you get the same sad face Daddy gets when he talks about her. And you know how to do all the things mums and sisters know how to do." Amy was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear it, she said, "I think I might be, but I'm not the same person I was before. That little girl, she's gone. The people who took her made sure of that." Thomas felt his heart break for the second time in his life. The first had been the day Hannah disappeared. This was the day he truly understood what had happened to her in the years since. "They told me my family didn't want me," Amy continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had burst. "They said I was worthless, that no one was looking for me, that I belonged to them now. They gave me a new name, told me I was someone else. They moved me around, kept me locked up, made me forget everything about before. But I never forgot the necklace. I hid it, kept it safe. It was the only piece of Hannah they couldn't take away." Thomas wanted to rage, to find the people who had stolen his sister's childhood and her identity, and make them pay. But Amy wasn't finished. "When I got older, they gave me to other people, a religious group in Montana. They said I was chosen, special, that God had a plan for me. But it wasn't God. It was just more prison, just different walls." She touched the rabbit pendant at her throat. "I escaped 3 months ago. Stole a car, drove toward Iowa because I remembered something about cornfields and a boy who used to chase me through them. I was trying to find home." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them knew how to cross. Thomas reached out slowly, giving Amy time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "You found it," he said simply. "You're home now." But even as he said the words, he wondered if it could really be that simple. Could they just pick up where they'd left off 36 years ago? Could love and time heal the kind of damage Amy had endured? And what would happen when the outside world inevitably intruded on their fragile bubble of healing? The answer came sooner than Thomas expected. 2 days after Amy's confession, a black sedan pulled up outside their trailer. Thomas watched through the window as 2 people in dark suits got out, their movements crisp and official. Social services, he realized with a sinking heart. Someone had reported Amy's situation, probably the hospital staff who'd been bound by law to file reports about suspicious circumstances. Thomas opened the door before they could knock, stepping outside and pulling it closed behind him. Amy was inside with Mia, helping with homework. He wanted to keep her hidden for as long as possible. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Rebecca Kane with the FBI. This is Agent Torres. We understand you've been harboring a missing person named Amy Johnson. Thomas's mouth went dry. FBI meant this was bigger than he'd thought. She's not missing, he said carefully. She's staying with us voluntarily. Agent Kane consulted her tablet. According to our records, Amy Johnson is actually Hannah Mitchell, who was abducted from Cedar Falls, Iowa in 1988. She was recently rescued from a compound in Montana and disappeared from a halfway house in Denver before we could complete our investigation. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Hannah had been rescued. She'd been in government custody in some kind of halfway house, and she'd run away. Run away and somehow made her way back to Cedar Falls, back to him. Is she in trouble? He asked. Agent Kane's expression softened slightly. She's not in trouble, Mr. Mitchell, but she is a victim of a very serious crime. We need to complete our investigation, and she needs specialized counseling to help her reintegrate into society. The trauma she's endured... She trailed off, but Thomas could fill in the blanks. She's safe here, Thomas said desperately. She's starting to remember things, starting to heal. Please don't take her away again. But even as he spoke, he could see the inevitability in the agents' faces. They had protocols to follow, systems to navigate. Amy's well-being, as they saw it, required professional intervention, not the amateur efforts of a plumber and his 8-year-old daughter. We understand your concern, Agent Torres said kindly. But this isn't a choice. Ms. Mitchell needs to come with us. Thomas thought about running, about grabbing Amy and Mia and disappearing into the vast American heartland. But he was a practical man, and he knew they wouldn't get far. Instead, he asked for time to explain the situation to Amy, to prepare her for what was coming. The agents agreed to give him an hour. Inside the trailer, Amy took the news with a calmness that broke Thomas's heart. I knew this would happen, she said quietly. I always knew they'd find me eventually. We'll fight this, Thomas promised. I'll get a lawyer. We'll prove you belong here with us. But Amy shook her head. You can't fight the government, Thomas. Nobody can. She knelt in front of Mia, who was crying without fully understanding why. You be good for your daddy, okay? And remember that sometimes people have to go away, but that doesn't mean they stop loving you. She pulled off the rabbit necklace and pressed it into Mia's small hands. This belongs to your family now. Keep it safe for me. When the agents came back, Amy went with them quietly, without looking back. Thomas and Mia stood on their front steps, watching the black sedan disappear down the gravel road. The silence that followed was deafening. Is Amy ever coming back? Mia asked, her voice small. Thomas wanted to lie, to give her false hope the way adults always did with children. Instead, he told her the truth. I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to try to bring her home. The next weeks were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Thomas hired a lawyer he couldn't afford, filled out forms that made no sense, and navigated a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to frustrate rather than help. He learned that Amy had been part of a larger investigation into a criminal network that had trafficked dozens of children over several decades. She was considered a key witness, and her testimony was crucial to bringing the remaining perpetrators to justice. The FBI was sympathetic to Thomas's situation, but their priority was the case, not a family reunion. Meanwhile, Thomas tried to maintain some semblance of normal life for Mia's sake. He went to work, helped with homework, made dinner, and tucked his daughter into bed each night. But the trailer felt empty without Amy's quiet presence. No one made perfect coffee in the morning. No one hummed while doing dishes. No one braided Mia's hair with patient, gentle fingers. It was like losing Hannah all over again, except this time Thomas knew exactly where she was and couldn't reach her. Then, 6 weeks after Amy had been taken away, Thomas's phone rang at 3 a.m. Unknown number. He answered, expecting a wrong number or a telemarketer. Instead, he heard Amy's voice, barely a whisper. "Thomas, I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else—" She was crying, he realized. "Where are you?" he asked, already reaching for his pants. "The Greyhound station in Des Moines. I ran away again. I can't do this anymore. I can't sit in rooms and tell strangers about the things that happened to me. I just want to come home." Thomas was in his truck and driving toward Des Moines before Amy finished talking. He found her huddled on a bench outside the bus station, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on the day the agents took her, and she had nothing else except a small backpack. "They're going to be looking for you," Thomas said as he helped her into the truck. "The FBI, social services, everyone?" Amy nodded. "I know, but I had to try. I had to see if there was still a place for me here." They drove back to Cedar Falls in silence, both of them knowing that their time was limited. When they got home, Mia was still asleep, curled up in her bed with the rabbit necklace clutched in her fist. Amy stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the child sleep. "She looks peaceful," she whispered. "I never looked peaceful when I slept. Even as a little girl, I had nightmares." Thomas wanted to tell her that she could have peaceful sleep now, that they would keep her safe, but he knew it wasn't that simple. They sat at the kitchen table as dawn broke over Cedar Falls, drinking coffee and talking in quiet voices. Amy told him about the halfway house, the endless therapy sessions, the well-meaning counselors who wanted her to confront traumas she wasn't ready to face. "They kept asking me to remember things I'd spent 36 years trying to forget," she said. "They wanted me to testify in detail about everything that happened. But I can't. I can't live in that darkness anymore. I've been in the dark long enough." Thomas understood. He'd spent 36 years living with his own darkness, his own guilt and regret. The difference was that his trauma had been the loss of his sister. Amy's trauma was everything that had happened to her since. "What do you want?" he asked her. "If you could have anything, what would it be?" Amy smiled sadly. "I want to braid Mia's hair in the morning. I want to make you coffee that's not too strong. I want to sit on the front steps and watch the sunset without worrying about who might be watching me back. I want to be Hannah again, just for a little while." But even as they talked, Thomas could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. Amy heard them too. She stood up slowly, walked to the window, and watched as police cars and federal vehicles turned down their gravel road. "They found me faster than I expected," she said calmly. "I suppose I should be grateful they let me have this much time." She turned to Thomas, and for a moment he could see the 5-year-old Hannah in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for finding me, for bringing me home, even if it was just for a little while." The knock on the door was firm, but polite. Thomas opened it to find Agent Kane, looking tired and professionally sympathetic. "Mr. Mitchell, we know she's here. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Amy appeared at Thomas's shoulder, composed and resigned. "I'm ready," she said. But before she could step outside, Mia's voice cut through the morning air. "Wait!" She came running from her bedroom, still in her pajamas, the rabbit necklace bouncing around her neck. "You forgot this," Mia said, trying to lift the necklace over her head. But Amy gently stopped her. "No, sweetheart. That's yours now. It belongs to this family, and you're the youngest, so you get to keep it safe." She knelt down to Mia's level. "But maybe someday, when you're all grown up, you can give it to your daughter, and you can tell her about her Aunt Hannah, who loved her family very much but had to go away for a while." The agents were patient, allowing the goodbye to unfold naturally. Thomas hugged his sister, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, trying to memorize the feeling of her in his arms. "This isn't forever," he whispered. "We'll find a way." but Amy shook her head against his shoulder. "Some people aren't meant to be found, Thomas. Some people are meant to disappear." She pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Take care of yourself. Take care of Mia. Live your life and be happy. That's the only thing that will make any of this worthwhile." And then she was gone again, disappearing into the black sedan like a ghost returning to whatever realm ghosts came from. Thomas and Mia stood in their doorway, watching the convoy of vehicles disappear down the gravel road. But this time felt different. This time, Thomas didn't feel the crushing weight of failure and guilt that had followed Hannah's first disappearance. This time, he felt something that might have been peace. 18 months later, Thomas woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of humming. For a moment, his heart leapt, thinking Amy had somehow returned. But it was just Mia, now 10 years old and tall enough to reach the coffee pot, trying to surprise her father with breakfast in bed. "Did I do it right?" she asked anxiously, watching Thomas taste the coffee. It was terrible, bitter, and too strong, but Thomas smiled and told her it was perfect. The rabbit necklace had become a fixture in their home, displayed on a small shelf in the living room, alongside photographs of Rebecca and a school picture of Hannah from 1987. Mia dusted it carefully each week, treating it like the precious artifact it was. Sometimes, when she thought Thomas wasn't watching, she would touch it gently and whisper things to it, as if Hannah might somehow hear her through the tiny silver charm. Thomas had kept his promise to Amy in his own way. He'd stopped working double shifts, choosing instead to spend more time with Mia. He'd joined a support group for families of missing children, not because he still considered Hannah missing, but because he wanted to help other parents navigate the particular hell he'd survived. He'd even started dating again, cautiously and with Mia's approval, a kindergarten teacher named Lisa, who understood that some parts of his heart would always belong to the people he'd lost. On quiet Sunday evenings, when the dishes were done and Mia was reading in her room, Thomas sometimes sat on the front steps and watched the sunset paint the Iowa sky in shades of gold and pink. He thought about Hannah often, wondering where she was and what she was doing. The FBI had told him she'd completed her testimony and been relocated somewhere safe, somewhere she could start over with a new identity and a new life. They couldn't tell him where, of course, but Agent Kane had mentioned, off the record, that she was doing well. Learning to drive, taking college courses, slowly building the life she'd never been allowed to have. The trailer park was quiet on these evenings, filled with the ordinary sounds of ordinary families living their ordinary lives, children playing in yards, television sets murmuring through thin walls, dogs barking at nothing in particular. It was the kind of peaceful, mundane existence that Thomas had once taken for granted, but now treasured like a gift. Mia had made friends at school, joined the softball team, started talking about what she wanted to be when she grew up. She was healing from her mother's death in the resilient way that children do, and she'd accepted Amy's absence with the same matter-of-fact grace. Sometimes, on these quiet evenings, Thomas thought he could feel Hannah's presence in the warm breeze that rustled through the cornfields surrounding Cedar Falls. Not the traumatized woman who'd called herself Amy Johnson, but the spirit of his 5-year-old sister, finally free to run and play and laugh without fear. It was a comforting thought, even if he knew it was probably just wishful thinking. But maybe, Thomas had learned, wishful thinking wasn't always a bad thing. Maybe hope, even fragile hope, was better than the alternative. One evening in late summer, as Thomas sat on the steps watching Mia chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, she suddenly stopped and ran over to him. "Daddy," she said, a little breathless from running, "do you think Aunt Hannah is happy wherever she is?" Thomas considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider all of Mia's questions. "I think she's learning how to be happy," he said finally. "And I think knowing that we're okay helps her with that." Mia nodded solemnly, then brightened. I wrote her a letter today. Mrs. Patterson helped me address it to Hannah Mitchell, somewhere safe. Do you think the mailman will know where to deliver it?" Thomas smiled and pulled his daughter onto his lap. "I think the important messages always find their way to the people who need to hear them," he said. "Even if we can't see how they get there." They sat together in comfortable silence as the fireflies danced around them and the last light faded from the western sky. The rabbit necklace caught the porch light through the window, casting tiny shadows on the trailer's aluminum siding. It was a small light in a small place, but it was theirs. And sometimes, Thomas had learned, small lights and small places were enough to hold all the love in the world. Years passed. Mia grew up, graduated high school, went to college on a scholarship. She kept the rabbit necklace with her, wearing it on special occasions and important days. Thomas walked her down the aisle at her wedding, the pendant gleaming against her white dress. When Mia's first daughter was born, she named her Hannah Rose, and the tiny silver rabbit found a new neck to protect and bless. And somewhere, in a place that was safe and quiet and far from the darkness of her past, a woman who had once been a little girl named Hannah smiled at the sunrise and thought about the family she'd found and lost and found again in ways that transcended distance and time. She was learning to be happy, one small day at a time, carrying with her the knowledge that love, once given, never truly disappears. It just transforms, like energy that can neither be created nor destroyed, only passed from one heart to another across the vast and mysterious spaces that connect us all. The story of the Mitchell family had no neat ending, because real stories never do, but it had something better. It had the quiet certainty that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance, or even the deepest trauma. It had the knowledge that home is not a place, but a feeling, and that feeling can survive even when everything else falls apart. And it had the promise that love, patient and persistent and true, will always find a way to bridge the spaces between us, no matter how dark or wide they might seem. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, the corn grows tall in summer, and the fireflies still dance at dusk. A rabbit necklace passes from mother to daughter, carrying with it the story of a family that learned that sometimes the most profound reunions happen not when people come home, but when they finally understand that home was always with them, waiting patiently in the hearts of those who never stopped believing in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And on quiet Sunday evenings, when the dishes are done and the children are sleeping, sometimes the wind through the cornfields carries whispers of gratitude and love across the miles, connecting hearts that beat in rhythm despite the distance between them. Because some connections transcend geography and circumstance, some love stories are bigger than the people who live them, and some families are bound not just by blood, but by the invisible threads of hope and memory and faith that weave us all together in the great tapestry of human experience. This is the story of Thomas and Hannah Mitchell, a brother and sister who found each other twice and learned that the most important reunions are the ones that happen inside the heart. This is the story of a necklace that carried love across 36 years of darkness and emerged still shining. This is the story of a family that discovered that home is not a place you can lose, but a light you carry within you, ready to guide you back to where you belong whenever you're ready to see it. The phone call came during dinner, Ruby chattering about her day while Cole served homemade soup, and Grace listened with the patient attention she'd learned to give to 8-year-old observations about playground politics and cafeteria mysteries. Charles's voice sounded older over the connection, wearier than Grace remembered, stripped of the commanding authority that had once defined their every interaction. He was calling from a hospital room in Manhattan, surrounded by machines that monitored the heart attack that had finally forced him to confront his own mortality. The conversation was brief and painful, apologies offered too late, and forgiveness requested without the humility to truly earn it. Grace listened to the man who'd shaped her early life attempt to build bridges he'd spent decades burning, his fear of dying alone finally outweighing his pride in dying successful. Grace's decision surprised even herself. She would visit Charles in New York, not to reconcile, but to find closure, to face the ghost of her corporate past with the confidence of someone who'd chosen love over legacy. Cole understood without explanation, his kiss goodbye carrying support rather than concern. Trust that Grace's heart belonged to their small Oregon home, regardless of where business might temporarily take her. Ruby insisted on packing a care package for the sick grandpa she'd never met, her innocent compassion a reminder that children see possibilities where adults see only problems. The flight to New York felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Grace further from the life she'd built, and closer to the person she'd once been forced to become. Charles looked smaller in his hospital bed, diminished by illness and the recognition that money couldn't purchase immortality or genuine human connection. Their conversation lasted 3 hours, spanning decades of misunderstandings and missed opportunities, control disguised as love and rebellion mistaken for ingratitude. Grace finally understood that Charles had adopted her not as a daughter, but as a project, grooming her to carry forward his empire because he couldn't bear the thought of his life's work dying with him. His fear of irrelevance had created the very isolation he'd spent his final years trying to escape. When Grace described her current life, the small house, the modest business, the found family that filled her days with purpose and joy, Charles listened with the attention of someone trying to comprehend a language he'd never learned to speak. The funeral 3 weeks later was attended by hundreds of people whose names appeared in business magazines and whose companies shaped global markets. Grace sat in the back row, listening to eulogies that praised Charles's business acumen and philanthropic contributions, without mentioning his capacity for love or his ability to find joy in simple pleasures. She'd inherited nothing material from the man who'd raised her, but his death had given her something more valuable. The certain knowledge that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness, that building empires meant nothing if you had no one to share them with. The flight home to Oregon felt like returning to herself, each mile carrying her closer to the people who loved her, not for what she could achieve, but for who she chose to be. Spring brought new projects and familiar rhythms, the community center design that would bear Thomas Bennett's name in quiet recognition of the man who'd saved Grace's life and inadvertently created their family's foundation. Ruby had grown taller over the winter, her questions more sophisticated, but her wonder intact, her presence a daily reminder that the future belonged to those brave enough to imagine it differently. Cole's hand had healed completely, his fingers once again able to create beautiful things from raw materials and patient vision. Their love had deepened through seasons of change and challenge, proving that families could be built from choice rather than chance, commitment rather than convenience. Grace woke each morning grateful for the accident of kindness that had brought them together, the divine comedy of errors that had led her home to herself. The small wooden elephant sat on Ruby's nightstand now, its surface polished smooth by young hands that traced its curves while listening to bedtime stories about grandfathers and grandmothers she'd never met, but whose love lived on in family traditions and shared memories. Grace and Cole had decided to expand their family, not through biology but through adoption, offering a home to children who needed second chances and unconditional love. Their house was already full of laughter and chaos and the beautiful mess of lives intertwined by choice rather than obligation. Success, Grace had learned, wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in moments of connection, in the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful, in the certain knowledge that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely and without condition. The innocent observation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither adult was quite ready to address directly. But as they stood together in that tournament hall, surrounded by chessboards and the echoes of a hard-fought victory, Madison Clark and David Miller both realized that some games change everyone who plays them, and that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody keeps score of. 6 months after David Miller's tournament victory, Madison Clark found herself in an unfamiliar position, sitting in the bleachers of Riverside Elementary School's multipurpose room, watching Emma perform in the 3rd grade spring concert while trying to process how completely her life had changed since that first chess game at the community center. David sat beside her, wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn to their first meeting, though now it was by choice rather than necessity. His tournament winnings and subsequent sponsorship deals had provided financial stability, but he had chosen to maintain the simple lifestyle that had sustained him and Emma through their most difficult years. Success, he had learned, was about having enough rather than having everything. Emma's clear soprano voice carried across the room as she sang her solo in Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and Madison felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Watching this confident, joyful child perform with such natural grace, it was hard to imagine the scared little girl who had spent weeks in the hospital, or the father who had sat vigil beside her bed while his world crumbled around him. "She's incredible," Madison whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady at normal volume. David nodded, his eyes never leaving Emma as she moved through the choreography with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children possess. "Sarah always said Emma would be a performer," he said quietly. "She used to sing lullabies that could make Emma stop crying instantly, even when she was a baby." It was the first time in months that David had mentioned his late wife without the shadow of pain that usually accompanied such references, and Madison realized that somewhere in their journey together, he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory without being imprisoned by it. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed from a weight that held him down into something more like a compass that pointed him toward what mattered most. The concert concluded with all the children singing together, their voices blending in the kind of imperfect harmony that parents find more beautiful than any professional performance. As the audience applauded and families began gathering their children, Madison became aware of the other parents glancing in their direction with curious expressions. She and David had become something of a local celebrity couple, though neither of them was entirely comfortable with the attention. The chess world had embraced David's comeback story with enthusiasm, and Madison's role as his sponsor and partner had generated its own media interest. Several magazines had run features about their relationship, though they had been careful to keep the focus on David's professional achievements rather than their personal lives. "Daddy! Madison!" Emma ran toward them with the breathless excitement of a performer who had just conquered the world. Her costume, a sparkly blue dress that she had helped choose, caught the gymnasium lights as she moved, making her look like a small star who had temporarily descended to earth. David scooped her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "You were amazing, sweetheart. That solo was perfect." Emma beamed at the praise, then turned to Madison with an expression that had become familiar over the past months, the look of a child who had claimed an additional adult as family. "Did you hear me sing the rainbow song? I thought about Mommy when I sang it, because Daddy says she's somewhere over the rainbow now." Madison felt tears threaten at the casual way Emma had learned to integrate her mother's memory into her daily life, turning loss into something that enhanced rather than diminished her joy. "I heard every note," Madison said. "Your Mommy would be so proud of you." As they prepared to leave the school, several other parents approached with congratulations about Emma's performance and questions about David's next tournament schedule. Madison watched him handle the attention with the kind of gracious professionalism he had developed since returning to competitive play, but she could see the slight tension in his posture that suggested he was still adjusting to being a public figure again. The drive home took them through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, past the community center where they had first met, and the elementary school where David still occasionally worked as a substitute teacher. Emma chatted from the back seat about her classmates' performances and her plans for summer vacation, her voice providing a cheerful soundtrack to the comfortable silence between the adults. "I've been thinking," David said as they pulled into Madison's driveway, a ritual that had developed over months of shared dinners and homework supervision and chess lessons. About what comes next. Madison felt her stomach flutter with anticipation mixed with anxiety. They had been carefully avoiding conversations about the future, focusing instead on the day-to-day reality of building something neither of them had expected to find. "What kind of thinking?" David turned off the engine and looked at her with the same focused intensity he brought to critical chess positions. "I've been offered a spot in the U.S. Championship qualifying cycle. It would mean more travel, higher stakes, the kind of pressure I walked away from 5 years ago." Emma had gone quiet in the back seat, and Madison realized that she was listening to the conversation with the sharp attention of a child who understood that adult decisions could change everything about her world. "And?" Madison prompted, though she thought she could guess the direction of his thoughts. "And I keep thinking about what you said at the hospital, about helping Emma know that her father is a hero. I want her to see that choosing love doesn't mean giving up on excellence, that you can honor the people you've lost by becoming the best version of yourself." Madison nodded, understanding both the ambition and the fear in his voice. "But?" David smiled, the expression carrying all the wisdom he had gained from loss and recovery and learning to hope again. "But I also want her to know that the most important victories happen when the people you love are there to share them with you." Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward between their seats. "Daddy, are you asking Madison to marry you? Because if you are, you're supposed to ask me first if it's okay, and then you have to give her a ring." The directness of the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Madison's heart race, and David's face flush with embarrassment. They had been moving toward this conversation for months, but Emma's innocent intervention had accelerated the timeline considerably. "Actually," David said, reaching into his jacket pocket with the kind of careful movement that suggested he had been planning this moment. "I was getting to that part." He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple diamond ring that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the car windows. "Madison Clark," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence he had shown during their first chess game. "You taught me that it's possible to build something new from the pieces of what you've lost. Will you marry me and help me teach Emma that love is the only game worth winning?" Madison stared at the ring, processing the magnitude of what David was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership in raising Emma, integration into a family that had learned to find joy after devastating loss, the chance to build a life based on love rather than achievement. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how quickly and certainly the word came. "Yes, of course. Yes." As David slipped the ring onto her finger and Emma cheered from the back seat, Madison realized that she had finally found the victory that mattered most, not defeating opponents or accumulating wealth or proving her superiority, but joining a family that had taught her the difference between winning and being happy. Emma's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Does this mean I get to call you Mom now? Because I've been practicing, and I think you'd like it." Madison looked at this extraordinary child who had somehow claimed her heart as completely as her father had, and realized that some games truly do change everyone who plays them, and that the best victories are the ones where everybody wins. "I would love that more than anything in the world," Madison said, pulling Emma into a hug that felt like coming home. As they sat together in the car, 3 people who had found each other across circumstances that should have kept them apart, David Miller reflected on the strange mathematics of love, how losing everything had somehow led him to gain more than he had ever dared to hope for. But Emma, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about the most important things, had the final word. "I knew you were going to be my mum from the very first day we met you. Daddy just took a long time to figure it out because grown-ups are sometimes slow about the obvious stuff." And as they laughed together in the fading afternoon light, Madison Clark and David Miller both understood that their greatest victory had nothing to do with chess and everything to do with learning that the best moves in life are the ones that bring people together rather than defeat them. Some games, after all, are won not by checkmate, but by finding the courage to say yes to love when it appears in the most unexpected places, even if it comes disguised as a challenge from a CEO who thought she knew everything about winning, and a single father who taught her what it really means to play for keeps.